He signed the debts, too. Those 5 words slid across the courtroom like a cold draft. They were barely a whisper, Nina's voice in my ear. But the blood left Vincent's face in a way I will never forget. For a moment, he looked like a man who had just been told the floor beneath him was an elevator shaft. His hand, the one that loved to smooth his watch during dinner conversations, trembled on the table. He swallowed and tried to smile. It didn't reach his eyes. My name is Alexis Dunst. I was 34 then. I had been married to Vincent for 11 years, and for 10 of those, I counted every cent that wasn't mine as if it were my own. I did that because, when we met, he had charm and a dream, a real estate operation that glittered like a storefront at night. I did it because my grandmother taught me to always keep one key to myself. Never let your life be all in one basket, Lex, she used to say, tapping the corner of her recipe box as if it were a talisman. I listened then because she had learned the hard way. I listened later because my son, Tyler, existed, and I could not afford to learn anything the hard way again. If these stories matter to you, if you like the kind of endings that feel earned rather than lucky, hit subscribe. I'm reading the comments, and they do mean a lot. But if you want to know how a whisper can topple a life, you have to start earlier than that day in court. When we were young, Vincent was magnetic in the way people with plans tend to be. He wore suits that fit like a promise. He moved fast, talked about deals over coffee, about turning empty lots into apartment buildings that smelled of polish and growth. I was working at a small law firm then, doing what I thought I did best, keeping track of people and paperwork. We were a practical match. I liked the order of ledgers. He liked the chaos of opportunity. I folded myself into his life because that's what you do when 2 people decide to build something together. We married in my grandmother's kitchen, under stacks of her recipe cards and the scent of lemon oil on the wooden table. She pressed a card into my hand and said, "Keep this, and keep one drawer locked where only you can get the key." I laughed then, thought it quaint. Later, I would understand why she had been so serious. Early on, the marriage felt like teamwork. I took care of the rhythms at home, schedules, taxes, Tyler's soccer sign-ups, the pestering emails to contractors that never ended, the dinners after long closings. I kept the house, literal and emotional, in a steady orbit. It was invisible labor in the loudest way possible. People thanked me for my lasagna. No one thanked me for making sure the insurance checks were cashed on time. Tyler would come to me with a scraped knee and the same look he now carries when he assesses a room and decides if it's safe. "Mom," he'd say, "can you—" And I'd set aside what I was doing. You get good at noticing patterns when you are the one who notices things. Vincent's attention wandered at first the way a candle flame drifts with a draft. He started canceling dinners for last-minute meetings. He began to critique details that were once unnoticed. My tone at family functions, the way I folded his shirts. Those were small things at first. Then he criticized the kitchen paint, sage green, my grandmother's favorite color, and said it made the house look old. He called it practical concern. "We need to look like we belong in the market we're selling to," he'd say, tapping a spreadsheet on his phone. He told me I didn't understand business. It became the phrase he used when he wanted me to defer. I did defer. I believed in the partnership. I believed in him. It wasn't dramatic. Betrayal rarely is at the start. It builds like mold under paint until a corner peels away and you realize the surface was never sound. The first real crack came 3 years before the courtroom whisper, a late night, one of those sweet-tooth insomnia moments that come with the kind of worry that won't let you sleep. I had taken on bookkeeping for a side property, just as a favor, because who would have thought profit margins could look like fingerprints? I was balancing a set of ledgers, the glow of my laptop painting the kitchen cabinet sage for a while, when I noticed a transfer that didn't match any invoice I recognized. The number was small, nothing a bank wouldn't overlook, but the account it went to was a rebate to an address of a second apartment neither of us had mentioned. I thought it might be a clerical error. I closed the tab, reopened it an hour later. One late night turned into 3. I traced one wire to another, and another to another, like following a trail of crumbs to a picnic that someone else had packed without telling me. Mortgages in names I didn't know, personal loans that read like promises to be cut, a crypto exchange account with a balance that fluctuated like a temper, and, worse, a series of high-interest short-term loans where the payments outpaced any realistic profit from the properties. There was also a small, shuttered retail space he'd labeled as an investment that, based on the documents, belonged to a shell LLC. Late fees, collection notices purposefully routed through a P.O. box, wires that stopped and started like a pulse under pressure. And the biggest ache, a second apartment in a neighborhood 2 towns over, with keys on a key ring that didn't match our home, a separate thermostat, a name on the buzzer that wasn't ours. I am not a forensic accountant. I am a woman who once banded her grandmother's recipe cards with rubber bands and labeled them by meal. But I had been bookkeeping long enough to know when numbers were trying to lie. I printed everything, out of some instinctual faith in paper. I made copies and put them into a cheap gray binder I found on sale. I labeled each section in neat, legal-looking tabs: transfers, loans, accounts. I put them in the bottom drawer my grandmother had suggested I keep for myself, and felt absurdly guilty for stealing a truth that wasn't mine to brandish yet. I didn't confront him. I couldn't. Confrontations end conversations. They provoke defenses. I needed evidence, not an argument. So I sat with it the way you sit with an illness you don't understand. You Google, you call people, you find a doctor of records. Nina Castellano, a lawyer I'd met through work and liked because she made complicated things sound like sentences, became the person I could tell. She read the binders like they were a short, ugly story and said, "This is more than messy bookkeeping, Alexis." She introduced me to an independent, retired accountant who'd seen enough creative ledgers to smell the fish. They told me what I needed to hear with the professionalism of a surgeon and the restraint of a priest. They did not tell me to hide things. They told me to protect the things that belonged to Tyler and to document everything with scrupulous clarity. They said the rest would be a matter of strategy and patience. There are important limits to what I can tell you here. Nina and the accountant made every move by the book. I am not giving legal advice. I am telling a story that required counsel. The irrevocable trust we created for Tyler, yes, that trust, was set up with a lawyer's signature and tax advice. It is a legal instrument, not a magic trick. It existed because Tyler's future was a separate moral obligation in my head, carved out like the drawer in my grandmother's kitchen. I transferred what I was legally entitled to into that trust and sealed it with attorney's eyes. That should be the end of that sentence and the beginning of a life that I could breathe in. The rest was patience. Patience in practice looks like small, boring, constant work. For 3 years, I became exceptional at being unexceptional. I went to soccer games and sat in folding chairs, the wind whipping Tyler's jacket open and closed. I filled out school forms and wrote checks for field trips, the same woman who had once balanced ledgers now balancing being present. At home, I made our sage green kitchen a place where calm could land. Fresh lemons in a bowl, my grandmother's recipe box with the corner card a little dog-eared from being opened. I kept our home as if I intended to leave nothing behind but clarity. Sometimes I painted, sometimes I mended. I learned to fold shirts the way he liked them, precisely along the seam, because small kindnesses didn't cost anything but made the theater of marriage work when we had an audience. There were nights when patience felt like punishment. Diane, our friend, started to feel like a thinly veiled alarm. She had been the kind of friend who arrives with coffee and advice, but in the years when I kept my eyes on the papers, she drifted toward the part of our lives Vincent wanted to make brighter, the deals, the networking, the cocktail hours. Diane began hosting small dinners at her place and inviting us both. The invitations stacked up like polite evidence that nothing was wrong. Lorraine, Vincent's mother, who once doted on my lasagna, became a critic of my utility. She started to ask Vincent, with that particular blend of guilt and entitlement, why things at home seemed worn, why Tyler's shirts might have a thread when, in her opinion, they should be crisp. Lorraine had always been on Vincent's side, emotionally. She had inherited a kind of loyalty that didn't question numbers. It assumed men in suits knew what they were doing. Their stances softened the edges of my outrage into something quieter, conservation. I needed to hide my outrage from them because I needed to play a part they would believe. I made 3 binders, each heavier than the last. The first was raw discovery, bank statements, screen captures, property documents. The second had the analysis, annotated notes from Nina and the retired accountant, timelines, cross-references. The third was the slow accumulation of corroboration, texts where promises were made and not kept, photos of purchase orders that didn't reconcile, emails where Vincent reassured contractors in tones that my grandmother would have called smooth as margarine. I kept backups on an encrypted drive and another copy with a friend I trusted to a painful degree. There is a cost to being careful. You spend a lot of time alone because secrecy eats at the small talk that fills most marriages. It changes how you laugh when others joke about shared futures. People who haven't lived in that quiet vigilance tend to think of patience as passivity. It is not. Patience in my case required constant motion, quiet motion, like running in place while people watched me stand still. I learned a vocabulary of small steps that didn't look like steps, keeping a ledger of my own expenses separately from ours, documenting every repair invoice, photographing a key with its tag. I made a habit of taking pictures of receipts with my phone, the flash keeping the ink from bleeding. I saved conversations that mentioned cutting losses or moving fast, because speed makes people hungry, and hungry people make mistakes. There were small moral tolls. I lied about why I had to leave a meeting sometimes. I asked Tyler not to mention an odd dinner at Diane's house. I listened when my grandmother said, "You did right," and felt the heat of shame for having to be right about something so ugly. The work was not glamorous. It was scrubbing counters while planning a future I might not have. It was smiling while my hands clenched in my pocket. It was letting people see the part of me that seemed to belong to chaos and keeping the other part where it belonged, locked, cataloged, funded. 3 anniversaries passed in that quiet planning. The first year I had the initial binders, raw, bleeding facts, and thought I could fix everything with a conversation. The second year I had begun sculpting a legal strategy with Nina, what to present, how to frame things, how to make my own assets untouchable insofar as the law allowed. The third year I had perfected the act of being resigned. I told people I wanted nothing. I practiced saying the words, "Take the house, take the cars, take whatever you think you need." It is a strange thing to practice defeat. It goes against the grain. But acting is useful. People lower their guards when empathy makes them believe the other side is fragile. Vincent's impatience, once a virtue in the marketplace, became his undoing in the living room. He had a girlfriend then, Brittany, who was quick to nudge him toward finality. She didn't like waiting. She liked action and photos and things that could be shown on a Saturday afternoon with a certain angle and a ring light. When Brittany pushed for haste, she was actually compressing the hours in which he might think. I never stopped loving Tyler the way a mother does, sharp and unconditional. Yet I also needed him to be protected by systems he would never have to manage. That is why the irrevocable trust existed. Hands off, secure, something legally insulated from the fraudulence of another's spending. Nina explained it to me carefully and said, "This is about providing for Tyler separately. We're not hiding anything. We are preserving what legitimately belongs to him." I liked the sentence because it kept us honest. The trust was not a weapon. It was a child-proof lock on his future. There were nights Tyler would look at me like he was trying to count the bruises in my eyes to understand if his world was broken. I never told him the details. He didn't need the accounting of betrayal. He only needed to know he was safe. So I folded his laundry and made his favorite pancakes on the mornings I had to be somewhere important. I took him to the school play and applauded with the force of someone who had learned to celebrate small living things. He watched me in the margins, and sometimes he would cross the room and rest his shoulder against me. Those were the moments that cut through the ledger-laden nights, a pressed forehead, a small thumb tracing the top of my hand. I would hold him and not tell him the quiet arithmetic of my plans. The people around us came in and out of the story like background actors in a long, tedious play. Lorraine, with her low sighs and embittered disappointment, sometimes called to ask if I'd considered letting the house go. Diane texted me recipes, and then later texted sidewise compliments about Vincent's new projects, the kind that are really invitations. Brittany was a shadow in photos at the mall, half smile and perfect contour, the kind of person who looks good next to public success. None of them knew the binders were stacked under my sink like a secret altar. They would have laughed at the idea, maybe said I was paranoid. It is a lonely comfort to be believed by paper. We reached the point where I had to choose how to make my entrance into the arena. I could have confronted Vincent. I could have torn everything down and let auditors and feelings collide in a way that would have left Tyler in the middle. I chose instead to set a stage where truth would be unavoidable, and the cost of haste would be on the person who took it. That sentence is worth repeating in a quieter voice. I arranged for the truth to land where the person who had been in a hurry would have to feel its weight. The plan, if you can call it that, wasn't a spectacle. It was paperwork and timing, and the very human art of not being believed until you are undeniable. Nina and I assembled a narrative that the court could understand, a catalog of promises, a map of transfers, documentation showing who had benefited and who had paid. But legal doors open only if someone knocks from the right side. So I spent months making myself small in public. I stopped defending the marriage in front of others. I let rumors do their work. I let Vincent hear from the world that I had nothing left to fight for. He took the bait. The mediation came after a long winter of looking like I was tired and willing to leave with little more than my car keys and a box of clothes. I packed a few things into garbage bags I found downstairs and took slow walks to give the neighbors the performance of a woman unembellished and resigned. I photographed the bags, because habit makes us record absurd things. Brittany's picture framed on our hallway table looked like a postcard from a life I didn't recognize. Diane called one afternoon to offer support, and I accepted with the same thin voice one uses to take a hand when sinking. Lorraine sent recipes and pity in equal measure. The ritual was working. On the morning of mediation, the house smelled like orange cleaning spray and something I had fried the night before to comfort Tyler. He had his backpack on and kept his movements clipped, adolescent, protective of his own rhythm. He kissed my cheek and left for school without stopping for a long talk. At the table, the documents lay like a map I had memorized. Nina sat across from me, the retired accountant beside her like a man assigned to watch the weather. Harold, Vincent's lawyer, arrived with a calm efficiency that looks like confidence and sometimes is indistinguishable from hubris. Vincent came in wearing a new tie that flashed like a promise he thought he had kept. He looked hungry in a way that made me sick. I played tired. I played the woman who wanted nothing. I let my voice stumble. It is theater, I tell you. Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because people are honest with documents more than with faces. Harold wanted an immediate signature. Brittany texted him a heart emoji from the car. Diane sent a "hope things go smoothly," and Lorraine said she couldn't sleep worrying. I smiled with those around me like someone who had practiced not fighting. We sat at that negotiation table like actors in a script that would determine years. Nina listened, my hands folded so they didn't betray me. I folded them together, the way my grandmother used to fold recipe cards. Neat, precise, a quiet insistence on order. I said the phrases people expect at a divorce table. I want to be fair. I don't want to drag things out. I want Tyler to be okay. Vincent's impatience showed in the way he tapped the pen on the table. I could see him calculating. Take the house, take the business, move on faster. What he did not see, because he never read beyond balance sheets and shiny lids, was the line at the bottom of the settlement that Nina had insisted upon, and Harold had, in his haste, failed to interrogate. I am not going to explain the clause. That would be both crude and irresponsible. What matters is this. The document that looked like a surrender had been written to include not only the assets that could be seen, but the liabilities that shadowed them. It was a legal mirror, and when you sign a mirror, you sometimes forget to look behind yourself. It was not a trick. It was documentation of what actually existed. It was proof placed where a cursory glance might not catch it. If men in suits have a vice, it's the belief that speed can be a weapon. That day, it was his liability. I sat at the table and signed with the bland calm of a woman who had already rehearsed her lines. Vincent smiled the way a man smiles when he thinks a deal is done. Brittany took a breath, like someone practicing an Instagram caption. Diane applauded in a voice that I later learned was more for the spectacle than for loyalty. Lorraine wept in small, efficient peals that looked good in the light. Nina packed her pen in a way that suggested both relief and gratitude. After the mediation, we all left the room in manners appropriate to our roles. I went home with fewer things than I had when I'd arrived, but with the binders still under my sink and the small legal shelter for Tyler's future untouched. Vincent went home with keys to a house and the illusion of control. In that lull before the courtroom, the world seemed to continue in ordinary rhythms. Tyler practiced soccer, Diane called to ask if I needed help, Lorraine sent a casserole, and Brittany posted a photo of Vincent holding a glass of wine and smiling like the man who had taken everything. I slept badly that night, not because of fear, but because I was waiting for the moment when the evidence would do its quiet work and speak louder than the smiles. I will tell you this plainly. Patience is heavy. It crushes you in the places you forget to count. But it can also shift weight in ways a single, magical moment of expose never could. The courthouse, when we finally stood there, smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and polished wood, 2 things my grandmother would have liked. But that belongs to later. For now, know that when Nina leaned in and whispered those 5 words, the room moved in a way I had imagined in 1,000 private rehearsals. Vincent's face went white, not because he had been outwitted by malice, but because the truth is a ledger that does not care for charm. Even before the judge called our case, the mechanics had already begun. Creditors send notices. Phone calls arrive that demand answers. People who expected money suddenly see numbers they cannot reconcile. People who expected ease now face complexity. That is a brutal but honest thing. If you inherit wealth built on borrowed time, someone has to pay the bill. Sometimes it's a bank, sometimes it's a borrower, sometimes it's the borrower again, when their promises are revealed to be promises. I haven't told you how it all ends because this is the hinge, the moment between performance and revelation. I sat in my sage-green kitchen that night with a mug that still had a smear of pancake on its rim and thought of my grandmother's recipe box. I thought of Tyler's small thumbprint on the edge of a biscuit tin. I thought of how I had been told, repeatedly and politely, by people who loved us both, that I should be less suspicious, that marriages are fragile and paperwork is boring. I thought of the 3 binders under my sink and the small, quiet acts of protection that had felt like chores and had become armor. The next morning, the world would come in small and large ways. An envelope hand-delivered to Vincent's office, a phone call from a lender that used the polite, predatory language of collectors, a text from Brittany that said simply, "What's happening?" But those mornings were for later. On the last evening before the mediation papers were made final, I closed the kitchen drawer my grandmother had once tapped with a finger, and for the first time in years felt something like calm rather than the low simmer of dread. I made Tyler pancakes the way he likes them, golden on the edges, soft in the middle. He ate slowly, as if he could taste the difference between the life we had and the life he might. He said nothing about the adult's world. He did not need to. He simply came by and kissed the top of my head, then left for a friend's house with the same casual efficiency that adolescents possess when they're trying to show they are fine. I wiped the plate, stacked it neatly, and then I sat at the kitchen table in the dimming light, like someone pretending to fold into the night. There is a peculiar peace to playing the defeated role when you know the script and you know the audience will overhear the real lines later. It is a peace that tastes like coffee gone cold, and the kind of sleep that follows a long shift. I lay down the small white envelope that had arrived 2 days earlier, my grandmother's handwriting on the front, and I thought of how the world likes neatness. I thought of how a signature can be both an ending and an accounting. I won't keep you waiting longer than you deserve. The mediation was not the end. Harold's casual confidence would not withstand the documents we had tucked into Nina's briefcase, and Vincent's smile would encounter the arithmetic he had assumed someone else would keep. But I will not rush ahead. There is a particular cruelty in revealing a reversal before its time. Lawyers like Nina work in patient arcs. Truth has its own agenda. People who believe that speed is everything are often surprised when the slow, steady thing they ignored becomes a force of its own. So I sat at my sage-green table with a mug cooling in my hand and considered the small things I had collected. A recipe card with my grandmother's handwriting, a picture of Tyler at 6 with his mouth full of cake, a key that never fit any of our locks. I thought of the sound a man makes when he realizes the house he has stood in has foundations that weren't his. I thought of how many nights I had kept my ledger tidy and my heart guarded, and I thought, plainly and without melodrama, that when he took everything, he had not realized what he was really taking. There is a satisfaction to that sentence that is not cruelty. It is a sober observation. A man who takes a life without seeing the parts that make it is like someone who buys a house without knowing the plumbing. What he took was not merely a house or an account, it was responsibility, the kind of responsibility that comes due in quiet, precise bills. I had done the work of making sure those bills would be collected in a public place, with witnesses and signatures, and when needed, a judge. The sun had gone from the kitchen window and left a sliver of light on the countertop. I stacked the binders in the place I had always kept them and turned off the lamp. I walked to the bedroom and packed the things that could be boxed without causing a scene. Photographs, a sweater, the watch I had bought myself with a bonus from a year where we had both celebrated. I folded and placed them into a moving box as if I were preparing for a small, dignified exile. I was not leaving because I had to. I was staging the moment so that my departure would fit the story I needed to tell. At midnight, I sat up and peered at the clock. The house was quiet. I went to the drawer where the trust papers lived, the paper that kept Tyler's future separate and untouched. I laid a hand on the envelope that held the trust acknowledgement, a legal thing, not a talisman, and felt that peculiar mixture of grief and gratitude. I had done what my grandmother suggested. I kept something that was mine, and more importantly, something that was his. Tomorrow we would go to mediation, and I would sign what I needed to sign, and let Vincent think he had the upper hand. He would believe, for a few hours at least, that haste is a currency. He would spend it. The rest, as I had arranged, would be a matter of record. The next chapter would contain the sound of someone discovering obligations where he expected victory. For now, there was only the hush of our home, the scent of lemon polish, and the tins of recipes my grandmother had left behind, their edges soft with use. I slid the drawer closed and, for the first time in years, let myself breathe. I did not sleep well that night. Patience never grants deep rest, but I slept with a kind of companionable certainty. When you have done the work to protect those you love, the rest is an exercise in allowing the truth to do its slow, inevitable work. The binders were heavy in the morning, but I carried them like luggage that contained the map out of a maze. Outside, the world kept moving. Inside, the house held the quiet promise that the truth, once set in paper and witnessed, can change the direction of things. I went to the kitchen, poured coffee, and watched the steam rise over the place where the sun would soon enter. In a few hours, people would gather. Words would be exchanged. A pen would be placed to paper. A signature would be made. And when it happened, when the whisper came across my ear and Vincent's face went white, it would be because someone had finally read the ledger I had been making for years. The courtroom smelled like lemon oil and old paper, the same oddly domestic scent that had anchored so many of my private rehearsals. It was the sort of place where ordinary objects gain an official gravity. A stapled packet felt like a prophecy. A pen looked like an executor. Judge Patricia Holden sat with a kind of plain authority that made pretense feel thin. Her hair was a careful silver, pulled back. Her voice, when she spoke, folded the room into attention. Nina stood, and, in the measured tone she used when translating complexity into sentences people could live with, asked the court to enforce the settlement we had negotiated. Harold, Vincent's lawyer, made a quick objection. Procedural, polite, the sort of thing people say when they believe procedure will save them. The judge grazed the papers with her eyes and then looked up directly at Vincent, in a way that felt, to me, like a family member silently asking if someone remembered their obligations. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "do you confirm that you signed the settlement agreement on March 14th of this year?" Vincent's nod was slow. For a moment it was the same automatic thing he'd done so often, agreement by habit, assent as a reflex. Then a sound left his throat that I could only describe as the noise a man makes when he realizes the surface he stands on is not, in fact, solid. He reached without looking for his water bottle and knocked it with a hand that suddenly wouldn't stay steady. Nina did not speak in grand proclamations. She pointed to the page, the passage, the boxed paragraph that had been highlighted in the binder I had given her the night before the mediation. Something Nina had called to my attention with a voice both tired and fierce. "Your Honor," she said, "the settlement includes a full accounting annex and the liability disclosure, which Mr. Mercer acknowledged at the time of signature. We move to enforce the settlement as written." There was a pause long enough for me to hear my own breathing. I watched Vincent's face go through several stages: confusion, then the slow comprehension that takes the shape of someone reading a bill they thought belonged to someone else. Harold, who had been smooth and swift that morning, was suddenly searching for language that would make the reality pliable. He leaned in and said something quietly. I couldn't hear the words, only that they made Vincent's shoulders tighten, as if someone had just said the wrong prayer at the wrong altar. The judge peered at Harold and then at Nina. "This court enforces settlements that are voluntarily entered and documented," she said. "If there is ambiguity about whether a party understood the terms, there are mechanisms to address that. But the record shows signature by both parties and counsel. Motion granted." Motion granted. Those two words landed like a bell. They were not a surprise to me, because the truth had already been filed, labeled, and witness sworn. But they felt like vindication in a slow, administrative way that is more satisfying than theatrical revenge. The room exhaled in different directions. Nina's small smile was private and contained. Harold's jaw worked and then stopped. Vincent stood as if he might faint. His tie was no help. He had signed on his phone 100 signatures by now, deals, receipts, mortgage docs, but this one had weight. He clutched the back of his chair and then stumbled down the aisle as if the world had gained an unanticipated slope. His phone started to vibrate before he reached the door. He answered, then went very still. The color leached out of his face, and an audible rustle went through the spectator bench as people who knew him, networkers, a contractor who had once poured him espresso, shifted to look. Brittany, who had been leaning forward with the sort of expectant smile that photographs well, sat back abruptly and, for a moment, looked like she could not reconcile the man she wanted with the man she had. There was no drama like in the movies, no shouted confession, no last-minute tearful apology. Real life tends to do quiet demolitions, phone calls, letters, accounts that bob to the surface like debris. In the next 48 hours, Vincent's voicemail filled with the kind of messages that sound like urgency, professional, animal, and precise. Lenders asked to speak. A contractor requested immediate reconciliation of accounts. A manager from a development partner left a carefully neutral message asking for written confirmation. His bank called. A tax service sent an email flagged as urgent. The people who had been willing to bet on charm found their bet complicated by the arithmetic of obligations. Brittany stopped posting for a week. Her story had been full of sunlit brunches and potential. Suddenly, her feed was quiet. In 2 weeks, she was posting photos from a coastal trip without Vincent, and then, a few days later, with a different man in a different frame. People noticed, and then they stopped noticing. Social media is a fast eater of drama. Real consequences are slower. Outside the legal wound, life took on its micro-habits. Tyler's phone buzzed a lot those days. He had always been careful with his words in public, and now he slid into private places to ask questions. Small, practical questions. "Are we okay?" was one he asked, and then, because teenagers are tactically embarrassed by intimacy, he would look away and add, "Like, legally?" I would say, "We're taking care of things, kiddo," and mean it in the slow but certain way I'd come to mean things during those 3 years of patient preparation. He didn't need the minute ledger. He needed the fact of us. He needed pancakes, and the smell of sage green paint, and the small rituals that said adulthood was steady, even when the world was not. When creditors came, they did it in a methodical way. Letters first, then calls. Some vendors were practical and asked for renegotiation. Others were less forgiving. There were notices posted, then a lien here and a notice of intent there. I won't pretend it was all neat or complete. I can't map out every debt because that would be both tedious and unnecessary. The important thing is that the liabilities Vincent had assumed were real. Mortgages with high interest, lines of credit attached to LLCs he personally guaranteed, short-term loans that required immediate payoff, and a handful of investors now asking uncomfortable questions about returns. The settlement had transferred not just the keys, but the risk. Harold argued and filed motions. There were hearings that felt like static storms, lawyers trading papers, judges ruling in technical terms. Nina answered each motion with a clarity that looked effortless and was anything but. I watched her stand and speak on my behalf, the way a translator stands between two people who share a language but not power. When she described the documentation, the transfers, the account logs, the annotated emails, she did it like someone narrating a journey that had run out of road. The court accepted the settlement as a valid instrument and ordered enforcement. The outcome was messy for Vincent in ways he couldn't have anticipated. That is the nature of responsibility. It arrives in invoices. For a while, he tried to reframe the problem as external. Vendors who had been misled by contractors, banks that had told him different things, investment deals that had soured. It is always easier to direct blame outward. But the chain of signatures in our binders pointed back, and a careful reading becomes a mirror. He had, in his haste, asked for everything and not checked the fine print that documented where debts were allocated. That was not fate. It was a consequence. The public fallout was small and private. There were calls from people who used to feel like friends, some offering sympathy, others offering opportunistic counsel. Diane, who had hosted the dinners and joked about the exciting life of being connected to deals, called less and then texted once with a sentence that was more performance than empathy. "If you ever want to talk, I'm here." I did not return that text. Lorraine came by once, looking smaller in person than she had at holiday tables. She opened with a casserole dish and then, after a long inhale, said, "I never thought," and I completed the sentence in my head. "You never thought because you never looked." We spoke then, not to argue, but to set boundaries. She could be involved with Tyler in ways that were safe and supervised. She could attend his games, but she would not be allowed to make financial decisions or to influence him about our settlement. She accepted this, clinging to the decorum of grandmotherly love even while it bruised. Vincent's phone calls escalated into a stream of practical needs. People offered options: restructure, sell, refinance. A bankruptcy attorney contacted him. He refused to be the sort of man who would declare such a thing, and so he tried everything else in his chest first. Pride is an expensive currency. He stopped returning calls to some acquaintances. People he had once included in celebratory photos no longer texted about charity golf tournaments. Friends are transactional in ways that are rarely discussed. When the balance sheet changes, friendship can look conditional. For Tyler, the world simplified in ways that felt both cruel and merciful. He had to choose where he would live. The judge's decisions did not dictate parenting time. That had been handled in earlier documents, because I would never gamble with a child's routine. What changed was the texture of our days, instead of measuring his time by how quickly he could peel out of the driveway to a friend's house, he found he wanted to be at home where things tasted like pancakes and were arranged in predictable ways. He wanted me there in the evenings, not because he needed explanations, but because he wanted the steady person he had always had. The reconciliation between us happened in small gestures. One evening I found him sitting on the kitchen floor, knees hugged, watching an old soccer highlight on his phone. He looked up when I came in, and for a second I saw the tiredness of a boy who had spent too much time pretending adulthood didn't exist. He said quietly, "You kept the binders, didn't you?" "Of course," I said. "They're safe." He did not say, "Thank you," in the tidy way adults do. Instead, he put his head on my lap like a boy of 9 would do when he needs a reminder that someone is there. "You did a good job," he said, and in the way teenagers do, he tried not to mean it too much. I held him. It felt in that moment like a payment of a sort that was not financial, the returning of trust. Because I had not wanted Tyler to grow up with the spectacle of financial ruin as his first adult lesson, I made decisions with restraint. I did not throw victory parties. I did not take out billboard ads. I changed a few small things and kept many larger things private. I moved out, not in the dramatic dead march of a woman taking back everything, but in a measured relocation that honored the life I'd had and the life I wanted to build. I took only what I needed immediately: photographs, a few pieces of furniture, the watch I'd bought myself when a major client had given me a bonus years ago, but I left on terms that felt controlled. Vincent kept the house because in the short term, owning a house feels like triumph. It is only after the bills and the liens arrive that triumph becomes thrift. My apartment was small, a 1-bedroom top-floor unit with a sloping roof and a window that let in a sweet, honest light. I painted the kitchen sage green because habit is a thing of language, and I liked the way that color reminded me of my grandmother. It felt right to let the motif continue, a through thread. The sage green became a quiet sign. History had continuity. The recipe box came with me, battered and dear, its cards softened with flour and memories. I placed it on a shelf as if it were both relic and instruction. I enrolled in a community program for interior design, the way people sometimes enroll in a class to relearn a muscle they once had. I had always liked how a room feels when something is fixed, how cushions can shift mood like an accent in a sentence. It was practical and aesthetic at once. In the mornings, I took classes with other adults, women who were starting over, men who were making a hobby into a second career, retirees who wanted to nest with taste. There was humility in the room. people who had once have had status learning how to hang curtains. I felt strangely restored among them. My first client was Sandra, a woman in her early 50s whose husband had recently moved out and taken a large portion of the family's savings in a hasty financial decision. She had one small room that needed transformation, a bedroom that was gray and hollow. She came to me with a list of things she wanted to feel: calm, agency, like the room was hers for the first time. We talked a lot about paint and light. She had an old quilt that smelled of lemon and lavender, and I suggested we make that the anchor. The sage green made an appearance in a trim. When we finished, Sandra sat on the bed and let out a breath that sounded like a person who had gotten her hands around the possibility of a different life. "You did this," she said, and I realized how much I needed to hear it. Helping Sandra was not an act of competitiveness with Vincent. It was a slow reclaiming of a skill I'd had, arranging life in ways that made it livable, beautiful, and functional. I did the work with a client, sent a few photos to an online group, and then got an email from someone who had seen the pictures. "Could you help with a small place? My sister just moved out. She needs color but less gray." It began to snowball in the quiet, sustainable way that second chances sometimes do. There were administrative tasks, too. The trust for Tyler remained untouched, and more importantly, recognized by counsel as insulated from his father's creditors because of its legal setup. I don't want to go into detail about the trust. I've said this before, and I will say it again. This is not legal instruction. What I can tell you is that the existence of that trust changed the calculus of worry in my nights. Tyler's college plans, his small things like a first car, the kinds of expenses that make parents wake in the night, those were not floating in the same pool as Vincent's obligations. That gave me room to breathe and to plan. Vincent's life constricted in ways I had predicted but not savored. Without the illusions of continuous external funding, some of his partnerships dissolved. Investors asked for buyouts. Creditors got more aggressive. There were rumors of bankruptcy and internet forums where strangers debated his competence like they debate sports scores. He lost friends who had liked the projection of success more than the man in it. Brittany's departure was not dramatic. It was practical. She stopped sharing photos of their dinners together and started posting about retreats and new beginnings. I watched some of it from distance. I did not gloat. It wasn't that kind of satisfaction. It was a sober observation that when you accept a life without understanding its fine print, you accept the consequences on the same terms. He had, literally, taken everything he thought he wanted. He had not realized that he had also signed for the obligation to maintain it. People often forget that possessions are promises, to pay taxes, to upkeep, to hold insurance. Toss in appetite and a poor accounting of risk, and you have an unsustainable edifice. Friends who had seemed indifferent came around in two ways. Some with the awkward apology that says more about embarrassment than empathy, others with practical offers. I accepted a few of the latter. A neighbor who owned a small co-op took me to a networking breakfast. A schoolmother asked me to help with a community fundraiser venue. Slowly, work arrived. Tyler helped paint a wall in a rental client's living room and developed a steady hand for corners. We made the apartment feel like a place that could hold joy and not just shelter. There were still hard days. I had nights when I woke up and remembered the 3 binders under the sink, the weight of decisions, the calculus that had to be made. I missed the person I thought I had married, not because of sentimentality, but because shared histories are a kind of scaffolding that takes time to replace. There were memories that a ledger could never touch. Tyler's first soccer goal, a night of laughter when the oven caught flame and we pretended it was charming chaos. Those moments didn't vanish. They just resituated themselves in a life I was designing anew. One afternoon, months after the court, there was a quiet knock at my door. I opened it to find Vincent standing there, a man who had lost something he had never fully accounted for, and now wanted a small place to rest. He looked different, the suit less tailored, the hair longer in a distracted sort of way. He carried a paper bag of something he said was lunch. It felt, in that instant, like life presenting a moral exam. He said, "Can I come in?" There was a tiredness in his voice that wasn't performative anymore. It was real. I thought of the binders. I thought of the years of patience. I thought of Tyler and his small, steady face. There were many things I could say. I had rehearsed responses in the quiet weeks, sharp, forgiving, boundary setting. I had not rehearsed how to measure compassion against consequence when the person at your door is the one who miscounted the costs that could have consumed your child's future. "Sit," I said. I did not offer coffee. I wanted the conversation uncluttered. He set the bag on the table but didn't open it. For a minute we sat in an odd silence, made deeper by the hum of a city that had no interest in our private arithmetic. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said. There was no excuse left in the tone, merely a statement of fact. "Intent doesn't settle balances," I said, the sentence coming out more gently than I had anticipated. I had learned that honesty lands better with moderate force. "You took responsibility when you signed." He looked at his hands then, hands that had once smoothed his watch in moments of showmanship, and for a second they seemed small. "I know," he said. "I panicked." "People panic," I replied. "They make mistakes. There are ways to correct things. There are ways to be accountable." I watched him digest the idea that accountability is not the same as rescue. He swallowed. "Do you hate me?" It was the sort of question that serves as both plea and test. I could have given a theatrical denunciation, but a life of measured patience had taught me the value of answers that teach rather than wound. "I don't hate you," I said. "I am not an enemy. I am a mother, and I protected something that belongs to my son. That isn't the same as hating a person." He nodded slowly, as if absorbing a lesson that had been given in a language his previous life had not required. He stayed for 20 minutes. We talked in the way two adults do when they must reckon the past, not to reopen wounds, but to name what was true. I told him, plainly, that I had documented everything because people in markets sometimes mistake optimism for solvency, and I could not let that gamble be Tyler's future. He listened, and at one point he asked a practical question about custody. Nothing legal, simply, "Is he doing okay?" And I answered honestly. He left with a small, sincere, "I'm sorry," tucked into the tilt of his shoulders. Closure is not a single event. It is a series of small acknowledgments. For me, it came in rearranged furniture, in the quiet hum of clients booking consultations, in Tyler choosing to spend weekends with me without reservation, and in the way my grandmother's recipe card for lemon cake sat on my shelf like an old map. It came when I started teaching a small workshop at the community center, Design on a Budget, and watched women who had been through separations laugh and trade paint swatches. It came when Sandra recommended me to her neighbor, and when someone posted a picture of a living room I had helped redesign with the caption, "New beginnings don't have to shout." I am not here to tell you my life became a tidy success story overnight. There were bills to pay. There were moments when the financial rhythm of being an independent contractor proved less forgiving than a salary, and I had to pull double shifts, mornings in class, afternoons with clients, evenings answering emails. There were also unexpected comforts, a neighbor who lent tools, a landlord who understood the seasonality of my work, and a community of women who met once a month to share not recipes but strategies, how to choose contractors, how to set a budget, how to find joy in small things. Tyler applied to a summer program for young designers. He wanted to learn how apartments are staged for photos. He wanted to know how corners read on camera. I helped him fill out the forms and sat with him while he practiced talking about a project. He was good at details. He had his father's eye for scale, but my patience for finish. Watching him walk into a workshop with a determined look, half teenager, half small adult, felt like the payment for years of quiet work. People ask me what I took when he took everything. It's a fair question because the title of this story promises a specific kind of poetic justice. What he took was tangible: keys, accounts, a glossy narrative of success. But what mattered was what he didn't see when he took those things, the anchor points of a life that can't be cashed out. He didn't take Tyler's future because I had made it legally and ethically clear that it belonged elsewhere. He didn't take the recipe cards in my grandmother's box because I carried them with me. He didn't take the way our kitchen smelled of lemon on Sunday mornings, or how I had learned to let small rituals hold space for us. There is a wry satisfaction in witnessing the logic unfold. You act hastily, you sign rapidly, and records that have been kept patiently catch up to your momentum. But satisfaction isn't the same as triumph. I wouldn't call it joyous to watch someone face the consequences of their choices, even if those choices had been unfair to me. I felt more like someone who had completed a necessary task with moral clarity. The story is one of protection, not vengeance. I think often about the ways invisible labor functions, like a currency that nobody names until it's spent. People who do emotional labor, who smooth moods, who remember birthdays, who call the plumber and follow up on an estimate, often treat those things like secondary because they aren't line items on a budget, but they are valuable. They bind families, they make houses habitable, they teach children to expect constancy. If you are someone who has been asked to carry the invisible load, know this: documentation is one of the many tools of survival, not because it's glamorous, but because it translates care into a form the world sometimes understands. If someone had told me years ago that I would find myself teaching paint colors and cataloging binders in equal measure, I would have smiled at the oddity of it. But the two tasks, arranging a palette and arranging evidence, were not as different as they seemed. Both required attention to detail, an eye for composition, and a stubborn belief that the small arrangements of life matter. There are people I forgive in small ways, and people I have cut off in larger ones. Diane sent a message years later, apologizing for the times she didn't ask the right questions. I read it and filed it like a recipe in a box. An interesting note, perhaps useful, but not essential. Lorraine came to Tyler's 18th birthday. She brought a cake and a small, sincere speech about family resilience. She and I have a more complicated affection now. A shared grandchild gives certain immunities and responsibilities. We meet on neutral ground. Vincent, to my knowledge, struggled for a while. There was an accounting of pride and missed opportunity that looked different on the other side. He's a cautionary figure for me now, a person who went fast and forgot to account for fragility. I do not wish him ill. I wish, rather, that he had been steadier. People can change, and sometimes consequences are the only teachers available. Whatever the arc of his life now, he carries the knowledge of what happens when you sever the ledger from the life it underwrites. Nearly 3 years from the night of my first binder, I stood in a small store that sold paint samples and told a young couple which finish to choose for their nursery. They trusted me, and in trusting me, they made a small life choice that I felt proud to influence. Afterward, I went home and opened the recipe box. My grandmother's handwriting stared up at me in looping ink. Keep one drawer only for yourself, Lex, for when the world asks you to split parts and forget them. I smiled and slid the card back in. The sage green on my kitchen walls seemed brighter in the late afternoon light. There is a quiet pleasure in teaching someone to choose a color that will hold their laughter. There is also a deeper satisfaction in knowing that Tyler's college fund, small, honest, and conservatively invested, warms with possibility. We've had quiet nights where we watch a show and he will say, offhandedly, "I'm glad you did what you did," and I will answer, "So am I." Faye, those sentences never sound like triumphs. They sound like care. If you ask me what to do if you find discrepancies in your life, financial, emotional, otherwise, I'll say this: consult professionals, document carefully, and remember that patience is a strategic act. That is not a recipe. It is a truth about agency. Not everyone will have the same tools, and not every situation will resolve the way mine did. The important part is to be honest about the costs of actions and to anchor what you value to structures that can outlast a moment of recklessness. I continued to build my practice slowly, day by day. I started a small series of workshops for women recovering from divorce and for anyone who wanted to learn how to live beautifully on a reasonable budget. We called it Rooms to Begin Again. It was practical and tender: color theory, budgeting for contractors, arranging secondhand furniture, and the occasional conversation about what keeps you choosing the same patterns. People came with questions and left with painted samples and something harder, a sense that their lives could be arranged anew. The last time I saw Harold in court, it was procedural: filings, signatures, acknowledgments. We exchanged a polite, professional nod. He had been a worthy adversary, competent, brisk, and humane in the rare ways lawyers sometimes manage to be. Nina's handshake was warm that day, a squeeze that conveyed solidarity without spectacle. Judges do their job, lawyers do theirs, and lives continue beyond the paperwork. On a golden Sunday in late summer, Tyler and I invited a small group of friends over. Sandra brought a lemon cake that tasted like memory. Lorraine came with a casserole and, at the corner of the table, placed a napkin with my grandmother's handwriting folded into it like a small truce. We ate and laughed in a house that smelled of lemon oil and paint. It was not a celebration of victory over a person. It was a recognition of repair. The binders remained in a locked file at my lawyer's office, an awkward, necessary artifact of that chapter. The recipe box sat on the counter. There is an odd satisfaction in the plain facts of life rearranged: debts settled, some bridges mended, work rediscovered, a child's trajectory protected. If you look for a moral in this story, it is modest. Build your life with measures that protect what you love. Do the quiet paperwork of love. Sometimes patience is armor, and the greatest luxuries are not houses, but certainty for the people you care for. If you stayed for this long, thank you. I tell these stories because they matter, because invisible labor has consequences, and because patience, when paired with clear-eyed action, can be a form of empowerment. If you liked this, there are more stories like it on the channel. Click another video on the screen. You'll find endings that are different but earned.